right, well, welcome everyone. I'm Dee Dee Petri, President and CEO of the Olmsted Network, and I am delighted to welcome you today to one of our continuing series of programs exploring the work and vision of Frederick Law Olmsted and the Olmsted firm. This is one of many public programs we, the Olmsted Network, sponsor. Please watch your inbox for our upcoming lineup for 2024. Now, tonight, we look forward to exploring Olmsted in the Pacific Northwest. To lead us in this exploration is none other than Laurence Cotton, who in so many ways needs no introduction. You've heard me talk many times about how Frederick Law Olmsted gathered experiences. And I can truthfully say that historian and filmmaker Laurence Cotton has also been gathering experiences for much of the last 4 decades, all of which inform his work today. Most of us first benefited from Laurence's work in the summer of 2014, when PBS broadcast a long-awaited film project, Frederick Law Olmsted, Designing America. Laurence served as principal researcher and as consulting producer. Since that time, the film has premiered across the country, and we were delighted to host it earlier this year in honor of Olmsted's 201st birthday. You can stream it today via PBS Passport, Amazon Prime, and YouTube, and you can also find a link in the chat box. Ever since the film appeared, Laurence has continued to do a deep dive into the Olmsted legacy, exploring the archives and visiting sites across the nation. But Olmsted is not Laurence's only focus. Mr. Cotton served on committees that planned legacy projects for the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial. He's played a leadership role in the creation of 2 water trail systems along the Snake and Columbia rivers. During 2022, Laurence and his longtime collaborator, John DeGraff, presented their newest film production, Stuart Udall, The Politics of Beauty. It was under Stuart Udall's influence that Lady Bird Johnson herself became an ardent conservationist, initiating her Beautify project, which she pursued across America. Laurence began gathering experiences in the areas of conflict resolution, international affairs, and international humanitarian assistance after graduating from Hampshire College. He served on the staff of Oxfam America. He was chief of staff for a state senator in the Massachusetts legislature, and he also worked in public radio as an independent producer. He relocated to Oregon in 1994 to serve as executive director of the World Affairs Council, and he currently serves as historian on board small cruise vessels that ply the rivers and coastlines of North America. We at the Olmsted Network are pleased to work regularly with Laurence, and I must add that the two of us had the great good fortune to retrace Olmsted's footsteps in the UK together earlier this year and to connect again at our conference in Milwaukee. Laurence will talk about 45 minutes, and then we'll have the opportunity to take questions. Please post your questions in the chat box or Q&A so that we can provide them to our speaker. With that, let me turn this over to our distinguished speaker, Laurence Cotton.
And hello, everyone, and let me share my screen here. There we go. Greetings, everyone, and thanks very much for the introduction, Dee Dee. I don't know who it was you were just talking about, someone else out there in the universe, but that's correct. You and I and a wonderful small group did have a very pleasurable and memorable trip retracing Mr. Olmsted's walking and carriage tour and horseback and train tour of England and Wales this past spring. It was quite delightful. Also, I assume some others out there were just with us in Milwaukee at a wonderful, wonderful conference that Dee Dee and the Olmsted Network and her staff planned and hosted for us. What a wonderful gathering that was. I realize that I'm among other experts and practitioners out there today, probably including friends and colleagues on this virtual gathering. So greetings to all, and I owe a deep debt of gratitude to Dee Dee, to her staff, and to the board of the Olmsted Network, and to many in our audience today who've supported me in my research and peripatetic Olmsted travels through the years. Just to give you briefly, I'm not here to talk about the film today, and I'm not really here to talk about Senior, but I want to set this up. So just to give you a sense of the path that brought me to to the PBS film project that was referred to. When I was young, I would visit the house of my maternal grandparents, very near Boston's Franklin Park. I would regularly walk along Olmsted's Back Bay Fens and Fenway to visit the Museum of the Fine Arts and the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. I would jog around Olmsted's Jamaica Pond and botanize and stroll around the Olmsted designed Harvard Arnold Arboretum. All of those parks, as no doubt you all know, are integrated into Boston's famed Emerald Necklace, a crescent of Olmsted designed parks and parkways that wind around a major portion and enclose a major portion of today's city of Boston. Eventually, I would visit Central Park, a little bit probably in my teens for the first time. And not until my early 20s, I came across Prospect Park in Brooklyn. The first time I walked through this arch, the Endell Arch, and looked down upon the expanse of Longmeadow there at Prospect Park. Tears welled up in my eyes as I was simply overwhelmed by its sheer beauty and utter perfection. I learned very shortly after moving to Portland, Oregon, it'll be actually 29 years this coming first week of December, that the 29 years ago that I moved out here, that the entire park system here in Portland, Oregon was master planned by another Olmsted, the stepson, John Charles. I began at that point to read Olmsted biographies and dug fairly deeply into the resources in print, in archives, conversing with scholars. And before long, I did approach an old friend back in Massachusetts, Laurence Cotton. I need to give him credit, a co-founder of Florentine Films with Ken Burns. And we did spend 7 years to actually produce this film that did indeed, as you heard, premiere in most PBS cities in 2014. And since that time, I have, again, as you heard, continued to present the film across the country and even in Canada. And I've given variations of this talk about the national and regional Olmsted landscape legacy. You could say that's what brought me here today. During the past 9 years, indeed, I've continued to dig into the Olmsted archives, meet with scholars, practitioners, explore additional Olmsted landscapes, revisit some of my favorite locations. So allow me, in the time that remains, to share some of my gleanings with you. I expect most of in the audience today have read those biographies and the other literature. You've attended prior programs in this wonderful series hosted by the Olmsted Network. Perhaps you've seen our PBS film. By now, you are no doubt overly familiar with the jewels of extracts, the bon mot, if you will, from Olmsted's pronouncements, publications, and the vast material available in the papers of FLO, the papers of Frederick Law Olmsted, which are available online through the Library of Congress. I'm going to introduce John Charles Olmsted shortly, but allow me for just a few minutes more, still focus on the father. And here's one of my favorite extracts from Olmsted Sr. In their arguments supporting the design for Central Park, there's a beautiful picture. Here's the greensward design. In their arguments supporting the design for Central Park, Olmsted and his collaborator Vaux wrote this in 1868. There is no doubt that the more intense intellectual activity which prevails equally in the library, the workshop, and the counting room, makes tranquilizing recreation more essential to continued health and strength. Civilized men are growing more and more subject to the insidious enemies to their health and happiness, and against these, the remedy cannot be found in medicine or in athletic recreation, but only in sunlight and such form of gentle exercise as are calculated to equalize the circulation and relieve the brain. It's one of my favorites. Of course, it's somewhat dated language. And obviously, we have a different, parks certainly have a different approach to active recreation these days than it did during the time when FLO, Mr. Olmsted Sr. was mostly focused on a passive recreation. But it stands the test of time, and it certainly applies to his sons who would carry on his work. Drawing upon influences too numerous and vast to cite today, including among other influences, the Romantic movement, English naturalistic garden designing, including the notable trio of Humphrey Repton, Capability Brown, and Joseph Paxton. Here is his Birkenhead Park in today's Birkenhead, England, that Dee Dee and I visited last spring, profoundly influential upon Olmsted Sr. in coming up with his design for greensward for Central Park. Also, the designs and writings of the writings of Uvidel Price and William Gilpin, the designs and writings of American-based Andrew Jackson Downing. Among other influences, you can our transcendentalist thought, certainly Ralph Waldo Emerson. I'm afraid his picture disappeared, but there was a picture, Ghosts in the Machine. But there is the original publication of nature, actually from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nature. Also influences from the Hudson River School of painting. And I'm showing this picture by Niagara Falls for two reasons. Not all that well known. Frederick Edwin Church, in fact, also from Hartford, was Frederick Law Olmsted's cousin. And the two of them were rather fixated on restoring and showing off the majesty and beauty and mystery of Niagara Falls. So now, one could also cite, in terms of Olmsted Sr., some of the, I'm not going to detail it, but the leading social reformers of the day. Olmsted Sr. was nothing if not well-read and well-connected. Well, why do I start with all of this? Frederick Law Olmsted was a voracious reader, drawing on a diversity of literature and a breadth of topics. He was an acute reader of the land, no doubt enhanced by his experience as a farmer. Well, remember, John Charles was his oldest son, his adopted son by marriage to Mary Olmsted, the widow of Frederick's prematurely deceased beloved brother John. We also know that Olmsted Sr. was the type of father who cared deeply about the proper education of his children, in particular, initially, the eldest, John Charles, who was already showing an interest and an aptitude in the father's profession. It is clear that Olmsted Sr. instilled in John Charles, and later Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., the same passion for the intellectual origins of this budding field, landscape architecture. Now let's talk about John C. Olmsted, John Charles Olmsted. Sequentially, nephew, stepson, and business partner of Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. He apprenticed with the elder Olmsted in professional practice as a landscape architect. The young man learned his father's acute skills of reading the land, understanding soils and vegetation types, and acquired his father's artistic skills as a draftsman and landscape designer. John Charles Olmsted, well, out of order, okay. John Charles Olmsted joined his stepfather's firm in 1875 after graduating from Yale. He worked with his father on many projects, including the Back Bay Fence in Boston, the Biltmore Estate that you see here in Asheville, North Carolina. Before the elder Olmsted retired was when John Charles was still working with him on these projects. Then, as senior partner in the Olmsted Brothers firm, John led the Essex County, New Jersey project, the first countywide park system in America, by the way. This is Branch Brook Park, famously under bloom in the spring and very near downtown Newark. Also, John Charles worked in Atlanta, Louisville, and the Chicago Park System projects. He also worked on plans for the New York State Capitol grounds in Albany and the plan for Stanford University. All of this preceded really coming out here to the Pacific Northwest. In the decades following John Charles joining the practice, the Olmsted firm became securely established as the premier landscape design firm in America. By the time of his death in 1920, John Charles's death, the firm's clients numbered more than 3,500, due in no small part to John Charles' skills as a designer and administrator. And what about the Pacific Northwest? Well, the three cities of Portland, Seattle, and Spokane all invited John C. Olmsted out here at approximately the same time. You could say that they cost shared, not intentionally, but in fact, de facto, that's what they did. And certainly here in where I sit, in perennial cost-conscious Portland, that was a considerable help. They really did cost share to have him stay out here for a period of time and multiple visits. Upon his first visit to the area, John Charles was struck by the irregular terrain, the towering trees. This is the slopes leading down of Douglas Fir, leading down to Puget Sound. He was struck by scenes like this, also distant vistas across bodies of water, such as this, the magnificent views of snow-capped peaks seemingly hovering nearby, view of Mount Rainier from Seattle in the 1920s. He was also struck by the lush native vegetation. He marveled at the size of old-growth trees and the beauty of the understory and the mosses. Plus, of course, he was struck by how the landscape remained such a vivid green, even in winter, certainly on the west slopes, the west valleys of the high mountains that line course through the middle of these two states. I do want to point out, by the way, I have a little bit of a humorous aside for you. I want to point out how John C. Olmsted's appearance changed. Here he is. Let's see, here he is. Oh my goodness, what happened? He left Boston. He looked like this when he left Boston. He started spending more and more time in the Pacific Northwest, and look how his entire image changed, and he even caught something of a Sherlock Holmes look going on. The only thing missing is the pipe. The interesting thing is, ladies and gentlemen, the same thing happened to me 29 years ago when I moved from Boston to Portland, Oregon. These things just happen. Well, in my hometown of these past 29 years, Portland, Oregon, John C. Olmsted designed the 1905 Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition grounds in Portland. He did the same thing for Seattle with the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition of 1909. The locals in Seattle refer to it as the AYP. In fact, pay attention to the transition here. You're looking at a artist's rendering of the grounds for the exposition. Look at Mount Rainier. That's the Mount Rainier Vista and the Drumheller Fountain in the middle. Well, this becomes the centerpiece of the modern day campus of UW. I'm going to use my cursor. There is the Mount Rainier, the Drumheller Fountain, the Mount Rainier Vista, and way in the distance to the southeast, more accurately represented in this photograph, is, of course, Mount Rainier. So now also, in addition, he took on the other commissions, not only UW. John C. Olmsted worked on other academic campuses across the entire region, not only UW, as everyone refers to it here, but also the University of Idaho. Here it is as a rough and ready landscape when it was first being built in Moscow, Idaho. There it is today, by the way. The centerpiece, the core historic centerpiece of the campus, is a John C. Olmsted master plan. Additionally, Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington, as well as landscape design elements still in place on several private liberal art colleges and campuses not far from Portland, including portions of the core historic campuses of Reed College. Well, here's Pacific University in Forest Grove. Here is Reed College, just to southeast of downtown Portland. You can see downtown Portland from this aerial right there. Also, here's Pacific University again in Forest Grove. I apologize for the repeat. And here is Linfield University, formerly McMinnville College in McMinnville, Oregon, in the heart of the Willamette Valley wine country. Also in the early 20th century, a certain college, once called the Oregon Agricultural College, hired the Olmsted brothers to offer some design advice and suggest improvements to the physical shape of the campus of what we now call Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon. There's the Memorial Union Quadrangle, the centerpiece of the Olmsted design. By the way, he came out to Corvallis in 1909, prepared a 60-page report to beautify and reorder certain aspects of the campus. As the result, the centerpiece of the OSU campus was named a National Historic District, the part that's outlined in violet here. National Historic District, the Olmsted plan at the center of that. It was named that to the Historic Register in 2008, by the way. What about our regional city park, Spokane first? John Charles Olmsted came to Spokane in 1906 at the behest of Park Board President and Parks booster Aubrey White. Just as he did for other regional cities, Olmsted submitted an overall park report in 1908. After some delay in 1913, park proponents announced Olmsted's recommendations. In addition to giving suggestions regarding Olmsted's 10 existing parks, the Olmsted brothers recommended 20 new additional properties and connecting boulevards. John C. consulted on many of these park projects and developed plans for 3 of them. The then Adams, now Cannon Hill Park, an absolutely beautiful park. Corbin Park, these are still parks there today, and Liberty Park. Here's the original Olmsted Brothers plan, 1909. This is the before and after, of course, an artist's postcard up above. Look at below, it's a ruin. It was bisected by Interstate 90. And this is a ruin of one of the structures or shelters in Liberty Park. It's actually quite evocative to walk through Liberty Park today, even though it's certainly isn't what it once was. But another park I want to call to your attention is Manitou Park. Now, Manitou Park pre-existed, but John C. came in and he suggested some changes and improvements. And in fact, he effected those changes and improvements. So people in Spokane do proudly point to Manitou Park, an Indian name, by the way, as a John C. Olmsted, as part of the John C. Olmsted park system for Spokane. Additionally, back to Spokane. Additionally, let me just mention before I move on, John C. Olmsted also offered advice for Coeur d'Alene Park. In the Browns Addition neighborhood, he proposed parkways along reaches of the Spokane River and the Latah Creek. It's another Indian name, Latah. I believe the locals pronounce it Latah. John C. Olmsted's private clients included the likes of wealthy business leaders in the city of Spokane, and he collaborated with regionally renowned architect Kirtland Cutter on residential commissions. Projects involved designing the properties of their magnificent homes on prominently situated lots, and he designed across the state line the Hayden Lake Cottage development in Idaho. It's actually a rustic resort and country club still there today. And the main lodge and the house lots, the siting of the house lots were master planned by the Olmsted brothers, at least the early phase of this rustic resort and country club. All in all, let's move to Seattle. All in all, John Charles would make 12 trips to Seattle, visits that would have a lasting impact on the Emerald City. The Seattle park system you see depicted here in the Olmsted Brothers plan and map would become as developed and as integrated as some of the key Olmsted senior park plans in eastern cities. In fact, every time I see this plan, it reminds me so much of Olmsted Senior's initial plan for the park system in Buffalo. I'm sure some of you are already getting that echo. Now, John Charles would work on some 35 different projects for the Seattle park system, more than any other city in the Pacific Northwest. He began with parkways, realizing that both park planning and city planning would likely follow. Olmsted quickly prepared a report for the Seattle Park Commissioners, completed in 1903. This initial report remained the key guiding document for future park planning. And among other recommendations, Olmsted proposed a 20-mile linked system of greenways, parks, playfields, lakes, and shorelines. Many of the boulevards remain today, at least in part, and you can see, of course, that system right here in this image. John Charles's park designs are still conspicuously evident in locations such as Volunteer Park. In fact, I suppose some Seattleites would consider Volunteer Park near Capitol Hill as the crown jewel of Olmsted Park's designs in the city. Here is Olmsted Park, Volunteer Park today. I would also add Green Lake to that list of stunning parks. It's good to show parks in active use, not just pretty landscapes. And Green Lake sure does get some active use, my goodness. And it sure is beautiful. And Washington Park Arboretum, not far from University of Washington, UW. Also, a few more. How about Madrona Park, another beautiful park. Woodland Park, here's an an historic postcard once again, but it became the future site of the Seattle Zoo, which is housed in Woodland Park today. Plus, Olmsted planned a boulevard that would wind its way around the bluffs along a portion of the Lake Washington shoreline. It's still referred to as Lake Washington Boulevard today. Most of it exists in some form or another. It's not completely intact, but it is a beautiful winding drive along the banks, the eastern shoreline, the western shoreline of Lake Washington. The opposite shoreline, the eastern shoreline, would include communities of Bellevue and Kirkland, for those of you who know the Seattle area. This is, of course, the Seattle side. Olmsted foresaw that residential development would eventually extend further south and consume the beautiful landscape of the Bailey Peninsula, jutting into Lake Washington. So he recommended including that peninsula in Seattle's expanding system of boulevards and parks, thus beautiful Seward Park today, another absolute standout, and I think the second largest in the entire Seattle park system, unless I'm mistaken, in terms of land area. During the end of the 19th century, the city beautiful movement gained momentum. Combined with a nascent interest in what were called garden suburbs, civic leaders working with firms such as the Olmsted Brothers planned green residential districts. In essence, Olmsted's Seniors Riverside set the mold for much that followed here in the West, and in the East too, for that matter. But here in the West, that would include the Highlands in Seattle, master planned by the Olmsted Brothers, just north of the community of Ballard, a neighborhood of Seattle. Also, well-known Ranchos Palos Verdes near LA, Southern California, and the uplands in Victoria. Also another site, the Sinalta Scarborough neighborhoods of Calgary in Alberta. Not so many people know that those two communities were also master planned by the Olmsted Brothers. But for the sake of time, I want to just focus on this one, the uplands. It's really quite extraordinary. Now a well-established residential neighborhood, the community of the Uplands, this is a promotional poster for it, in the Vancouver Island municipality of Oak Bay, just east of Victoria, by the way, was one of the earliest formally planned subdivisions in Canada. Beginning in 1907, the Uplands in Oak Bay was a landscape architect's ideal commission. The planning of an expansive residential district. Here is the early uplands, an expansive residential district nestled by the sea. The clients at the uplands allowed Olmsted the freedom in planning to follow the lay of the land. The land, by the way, was originally a site of First Nation settlements, subsequently acquired from the Hudson Bay Company. And the 465 acres of the uplands landscape was comprised of rolling countryside filled with gnarled Gary oaks, hedges of snowberry, and ledges with views. Here's a view, ledges with views of Mount Baker and the Cascade Range in the distance. John Charles found the landscape with its frequent vistas of distant mountains across water delightful. And here is the Olmsted plan for the uplands. You can go see it today. The upland sidewalks sit well back from the streets. Doesn't this remind you of Riverside, Illinois? They're carefully placed to just one side of the roads. Just as Olmsted planned swaths of smooth grass, uninterrupted by fussy planted shrubs or bedding out, to use Olmsted's language, border the streets that are lined by old-fashioned lampposts, as you see depicted here. There are patches of Gary oak woodlands. Let's see, here is Uplands Park, patches of Gary oak woodlands. While endangered in lowlands elsewhere, these woodlands, Gary oak woodlands, are there with tall grasses that are allowed to grow naturally. There are planted triangles that serve as parklets and curving streets. They add variety to the overall landscape scene. There's also this one large park, Uplands Park. Here's another image. Here's the, well, there's a slide that's apparently gone missing, folks. I've got a couple of ghosts, gremlins in my PowerPoint program today. But this is, again, an image of the Gary Oak uplands and the blooming blue camas lily, by the way. Aren't they beautiful? And this is part of Uplands Park, which actually has water frontage. It's a buffer between the section of the residential district and the sea. By the way, here at this park, there's interpretive signage that describes the history, including the early Songhees First Nations presence and the natural history of the uplands landscape. Olmsted's intended effect is remarkably intact today. He anticipated by many decades the trend for conserving natural vegetation, very much in the family tradition, if you will. Let's move back down the I-5 corridor. We're going to head eventually to where I live in Portland, but we're going to make our way down I-5 first to Tacoma, Washington. In our film, by the way, we recount a rather humorous response to Olmsted Sr.'s design for the original railway funded or railway town of Tacoma, Washington. The critics were very unhappy. They said the blocks were shaped like melons, pears, and sweet potatoes. As you can see here, there was not a single straight line or hard angle in the entire development, and Olmsted was hired and fired within short order. He didn't last. The modern day city of Tacoma, folks, was not built on such a plan. The designs were rejected in favor of conventional street grid. However, in the state capital, just a little further south, Olympia, a couple of decades later, starting in 1911 and completed in 1930, under the guidance of James Dawson, the Olmsted Brothers firm designed the landscape and circulation plans for the 54-acre West Capitol campus, complete with sweeping lawns and axial drives. Here's an image. I just toured there in August, a wonderful program that the Washington State Historical Society brought me and another speaker, Jennifer Ott, to speak both about the Olmsted presence nationally and the Olmsted presence regionally. And the chief horticulturalist for the state capitol followed that with a personally guided tour for all of the participants. Here's the West Capitol and Capitol Lake. Isn't that beautiful? Now, what about Portland, you're asking? Well, John Charles was initially invited to Portland by Park Board member Thomas L. Elliott. He arrived around April 1903. And his first project, in fact, I already mentioned it, was to design the grounds for the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition. Well, again, slides have gone missing. After considering other options, the fair would be sited around Giles Lake in northwest Portland. While working on that project, the rest of the Olmsted's time would be consumed by city park planning and some private client work. Let's see, let's catch up. I'm sorry, I apologize. Here, this is where I want to go. Here once again is John C. Olmsted in the Pacific Northwest with that very characteristic look. Here is the plan for the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition, the Olmsted Brothers preliminary sketch plan. And here is the official ground plan as was used in promotion for the Centennial Exposition of 1905. It was a one-year exposition, as some of these events often are, like the World Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Seattle. In Chicago, I beg your pardon. Now, Olmsted's, he would be working with Lester Leander Hawkins. This is Bill Hawkins' great uncle, Lester Leander Hawkins. There he is, Portland Park Commissioner Lester Leander Hawkins. He would drive Olmsted around town, riding over hill and dale in his horse-drawn buggy, the tally-ho named Jupiter. That's right, we have pictures of the tally-ho. Bill Hawkins has the whip from that time. Hope he didn't use the whip too hard on his horses. In fact, Hawkins became Olmsted's near constant companion and guide to Portland during this first 3-week period. Hawkins would play a key role in helping John Charles appreciate the unique topographical features of Portland that would eventually be incorporated into a parks plan. I want to give you a feel for John C. Olmsted's acute observations. These are taken from his extensive letters home to his wife, letters filled with rich detail. From a letter dated April 20th. This is 19, I'll have to double check the year. Letter dated April 20th. Quote, "It was on or over the hills back of the city, which are high and for the most part very steep and command extensive views. There are a few patches of the original tall firs, look at this, but plenty of smaller sizes. Some of the slopes toward the city are more or less occupied with streets, vacant lots and improved lots with houses, but often on fearful grades. It is too bad that the fronts of the hills and the ravines could not have been preserved with the woods on them as a natural park and background for the city. And this is John C. Olmsted. But the land boomers have played havoc with them and run values clear above anything reasonable and beyond the power of the city to purchase them. It is to be hoped that some steep slopes can be taken by the city and preserved." And this is Markham Hill, 1920. 3 days later, he wrote this, by the way. "We drove about 7 miles down the river as well as to places nearby along the way, and then circuited and zigzagged back, going far out on the east borders of the city. I saw what small parks there are in that section of the city and which are unimproved. The land speculators have been at work everywhere and with rather pitiful results." It's fairly evident that John Charles was acutely aware of the rapid changes to the land by private sector interests. Even at that time was quite conscious of a shortage of quality parks right here where you're looking at on the east side of the river. And it's interesting still at this point in time, the Parks Department is largely focused on new parks on the east side of the Willamette. I'd like to point out that the preamble to the 1903 Portland Park Report that you see here, laying out 18 principles or benchmarks that to this day helped as a founding, that are held up, in fact, this report and its 18 benchmarks are held up as a founding document in 20th century municipal park planning. In fact, one could even say that it was a bestseller at its time, with copies in circulation around the United States and apparently, from what I understand, around the world. Here is the 1904 park plan as interpreted by those working on this project during this time. The Olmsted brothers didn't come up with this little map, but this was prepared to interpret the Olmsted plan and submitted along with the report to the park board at the time. And here is how that plan was featured in the front page of the Oregonian newspaper of the day. It's hard to see the detail here. It's a little fuzzy, but it really, wow, this was the front page of the Daily Oregonian. This rather detailed plan with all of the images depicted on the sides. Now, an entire program could be built around the rather remarkable experiences of John C. Olmsted in his time in Portland in the company of L.L. Hawkins, park board members, and other civic leaders. John Charles was, of course, involved with park planning in other cities here in the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere around the country. As you already heard, the aforementioned Essex County Park System and so forth. But John C. Olmsted was particularly attuned, if you will, to local conditions, the natural features in the climate, but also to the political realities. He was responsive to each city's potentialities and also adept in adapting his recommendations to local priorities. In the end, it was under the leadership of hand-picked and Olmsted Brothers trained landscape architect Emanuel Mish that who was Portland's first park superintendent, by the way, that Portland has a beautiful system of Olmsted master planned and influenced parks and greenways to this day. It was Emil Misch who really carried out the Olmsted plan and designed many of the parks that we experience and love to this day. In effect, Misch was Olmsted's protege. Here are some well-known parks that were included in the original Olmsted Park Plan and that were subsequently developed. I'm going to just a quick slideshow of Portland parks. Here's Maclay Park. This is the so-called witch's house or witch's mansion. In Maclay Park, very near the Wildwood Trail in the heart of Forest Park, just north of downtown Portland, near the Portland's Audubon Society. It has a canyon trail there. It's gorgeous. Then there's Vista Avenue. There's famous Terwilliger Avenue or Terwilliger Parkway. It goes by many names. Actually, typically Terwilliger Parkway or Terwilliger Boulevard. There's also the Willamette Boulevard. There's Peninsula Park. Here's Peninsula Park with its beautiful rose garden. There's Laurelhurst Park, which is, here's the Misch plan for Laurelhurst Park, a mile from where I'm speaking to you right now. This is the characteristic image that you often see of the beautiful lake with reflections in Laurelhurst Park. Just a gorgeous, gorgeous classic Olmsted Park. There's the next door to it is the Laurelhurst subdivision. Other sites include the once intact Ross Island Park, Ladd Circle and Rose Gardens, very beautiful residential area. Kenilworth Park, look at that terrain, characteristic Olmsted terrain, isn't it? It's also characteristic of Portland and the Pacific Northwest. Also Selwood Park. He also proposed one large park be sited where an extinct volcano with wooded slopes rose up from the flat land below Mount Tabor. This is overlooking the modern day reservoir on the lower slopes of Mount Tabor with downtown Portland in the background. But here's the image from the summit. Beautiful, beautiful, large park with extensive stands of nearly old growth Douglas fir and beautiful vegetation, crisscrossed with curvilinear trails galore, ever-changing slopes and grades. It's just a wonderful, wonderful amenity on the east flank of the city. Additional Olmsted design landscapes include the Westover Terrace in Northwest Portland, a portion of the grounds for the Waverly Country Club, and the historic center, once again, of the Reed College campus, which I'm going to show again because it's actually in the city of Portland. Finally, a property that is on the top of many lists of one of everyone's favorite Olmsted Park sites as a unique spot. It's a private park open to the public, although it's just gone through an ownership and management change. I don't know its current status. It has changed just this year, but it was formerly the Peter Kerr Estate Garden, until very recent years known as the Rock Gardens of the Bishop Close, owned and managed by the church, but open to the public. Just extraordinarily beautiful, overlooking the Willamette River, just south of downtown Portland. John Charles Olmsted produced a second parks report in 1907 with recommended budget proposals for the building out of his proposed park system. There were indeed fiscal constraints, and not all of his vision for parks and parkways were fully realized at the time. But of course, in effect, we owe our thanks to John Charles Olmsted for recommending to Portland that the city preserve a very special urban wilderness that we now know as Forest Park. Unless I'm mistaken, now 5,100 acres in total. It still qualifies as the largest urban forest reserve contained in city limits in the United States. However, it is the second largest urban forest reserve if you move beyond city limits, because there's one on the outskirts of Louisville, the Jefferson State Forest, which is often cited as the largest such reserve. But Forest Park is completely contained within the city of Portland. And by the way, this is what John C. Olmsted had. I'm going to give you another image. This is how it overlooks the city of Portland. That's the St. John's suspension bridge in the Willamette, an industrial area of the Willamette River. By the way, it does include old growth. It does include old growth. And this is what John C. Olmsted had to say about this piece of land. Quote, although it is a very costly park, both for the land and construction relative to its breadth, yet in relations to the physical growth of the city is such that if not taken now, the needed land will soon be impossible of acquirement. So the city set it aside early on. It's only been developed to the extent that it's been developed at all. That development came later in the middle of the 20th century with trails and so forth. But it was set aside early on as a protected urban wilderness forest reserve. Like father before him, always thinking for the future. It does include, by the way, here's a modern day bridge in the Wildwood. This is Maclay Park, once again, the canyon trail that's right there. Not only does it have old growth forest, but boy, if you're lucky, you can occasionally at different times of the year, different parts of the park, maybe see elk, black bear, and yes, even cougar. So there's large charismatic critters in this large forest reserve. In conclusion, to quote from an essay by David Streatfeild on the faculty of the University of Washington, John C. Olmsted created a unique regional design idiom. John Olmsted's new distinct regional mode conceptually treated open spaces and parks and gardens as, quote, of course, clearings in the forest. I'm quoting now from David Streatfeild. The retention of large native trees and the wild understory emphasize the inherently picturesque character of Northwest landscapes. Notice that, the inherently picturesque character of Northwest landscapes. These forest clearings with their distinctive vegetation were subtly enhanced by the sensitive grading that characterized all of the firm's work. That's a brief quote from scholar David Streatfeild on faculty of the University of Washington. In a way that is surprisingly current, more than a century later, Olmstedian landscapes are indeed responsive to the local environment. Though John Charles would not have used, I have another image for you here, maybe here's the Hoyt Arboretum. Though John Charles Olmsted would not have used today's language of sustainability and ecological restoration, his design works with the existing environment to ensure their success and longevity. Now I'm going to close with his father's words. You can't but help occasionally hark back to the father's bon mot. Thanks for bearing with me. But here's the father. Here is once again John Charles in the Pacific Northwest. This is a beautiful image from the Boston Globe. All of you know this. From Frederick Law Olmsted. The beauty of the park should be the beauty of the fields, the meadow, the prairie, of the green pastures and the still waters. What we want to gain is tranquility and rest to the mind. Is it doubtful that it does men good to come together in this way, in pure air and under the light of heaven? Frederick Law Olmsted. Seems to be that prescription, if you will, rings as loud today in 2023 all across the land as it does here in the John Charles Olmsted neighborhood of Portland and of the Pacific Northwest, just as those words rang loud in the late 19th century. Thank you, Frederick Law Olmsted. Thank you, John Charles Olmsted and the Olmsted Brothers. Thanks to all of you for your time and attention today. I look forward to the ensuing conversation. I do want to call to your attention to the treasure trove on all matters Olmsted that you can find on the Olmsted Network website. In particular, I will call your attention to the YouTube channel, where you can find recent presentations by my fellow Portlander, Jim Sulin, who developed a very informative presentation about the ever-expanding 40-mile loop just a couple of days ago. Here is, thanks to Jim for allowing me to utilize just a couple of his slides from his great presentation. Here's the original Olmsted plan from which the 40-mile loop eventually developed. And here is the ever expanding iteration of the 40-mile loop in 2023. And in fact, there's even a more expansive plan that includes the suburbs, east, south, west, and north in today's Vancouver, Clark County, Washington. I just want to call your attention to another favorite program hosted by the Olmsted Network. David Zuckerman did a beautiful job on Olmsted's West, and that's available. He presented that in the spring. David Zuckerman, formerly of the East Bay Mountain Park system on the East Bay of San Francisco Bay. That's available on the YouTube channel. I just want to also give some credit and mention some books. Thank you again, everyone. That's, of course, the fountain in Central Park. But I want to give credit to Joan, prodigious credit to Joan Hockaday, a dear friend, formerly resident in the Pacific Northwest, now resident in the San Francisco Bay Area. Her book, Greenscapes, Olmsted's Pacific Northwest, is out of print. You might be able to find a pre-owned copy somewhere out there on the web. You can find this, a gorgeous book by the recently deceased Larry McCann, by Imagining Uplands, John Olmsted's masterpiece of residential design, which, by the way, won a national award in Canada for the best book design of the year after this was published. Wonderful coffee table book. Also, the inimitable Bill Hawkins here in Portland, The Legacy of the Olmsted Brothers in Portland. It's Bill's great uncle, Lester Leander Hawkins, who ushered John C. Olmsted around Portland in his buggy, the Tally-Ho Jupiter. And last but not least, I'm presenting these in order because this is the most recently published Olmsted in Seattle, Creating a Park System for a Modern City by Seattle-based author Jennifer Ott. So I do want to call all of those wonderful resources to your attention if you want to do even a deeper dive into the John C. Olmsted legacy here in the Pacific Northwest. Let's see, here's a screenshot of of our film, but I believe it's already been posted to the chat. There's the URL for our dedicated website, where there's much more than just the film available. There's also additional videos and essays up on that website. I want to give credit where credit's due, including, of course, the Olmsted Network and the Olmsted National Historic Site, the Papers of the Frederick Law Olmsted, the Cultural Landscape Foundation, Friends of Seattle Olmsted Parks, and, by the way, parks, conservancies, and friends groups everywhere. And I hope there's quite a few associated with conservancy and friends groups on this call today, and I look forward to interacting with all of you. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Larry. That was just fantastic. If you want to stop sharing, we'll look at you right now and open up to some Q&A. We do have one question, a very specific one. Do you know what building was in the background of the Tally-Ho Jupiter photo with Mr. Hawkins?
I'd have to go back and take a look at it, but I think it was the old Multnomah Hotel. I'll have to double check. Take a very large historic hotel, which is long gone in the center of downtown Portland. I think that was the Multnomah Hotel, but I'd have to double check.
And we have a question for you.
That must have been a Portlander asking that question. Yeah.
Here's a question for you about which characteristics of the Seattle park system share similarities with the Buffalo park system, something that you referenced early on.
Well, look at those. I wish I could call up. Some can conjure up in their minds their image of the Olmsted Park Plan for Buffalo, which is with its 3 sites and connected parkways, where Olmsted Sr., working with Calvert Vaux, came up with the design for the first integrated park system as we know it in America, and literally invented parkways then and there, proper parkways, not little skinny linear green strips, but proper linear parkways, often connected with landscape traffic circles. And the whole idea behind that was to think of the city as being contained within one large park, so that anyone, no matter who you were, where you lived, could have access to a park-like environment in Buffalo at that very formative stage of the city's development, where Olmsted Sr. saw himself as an urban planner. Well, John C. Olmsted, he literally manifested that with his masterwork plan for the city of Seattle, with 35 parks and connecting parkways. The idea being that you can be in a green space and you don't even need to be on macadam or a sidewalk. You can be as a pedestrian, even pre-automobile or at the early stage of automobiles becoming so widespread. You could be in a green space going from park to park along a linear parkway kind of environment. And it's really a more elaborate, the 35 park version design manifested by John C. Olmsted in Seattle is just a more elaborate modern 20th century iteration of the 19th century Olmsted original plan for Buffalo.
So another question for you, Larry, as you talked about John Charles Olmsted and his university designs, how would you differentiate his designs from, say, his father's campus presentations? Where were there similarities? Where were there diverging paths?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I can give a very thought. I can't give a complete answer to that. Again, there's and you can look at this too with FLO Jr. Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. After all, times change. Times change. Notions change about parks and park-like environments. Notions change for how to landscape greenswards, how to incorporate the placement of buildings. The aesthetic sensibility has changed later on with the City Beautiful movement, which certainly was very much in play with Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., just really beginning to take off in the early 20th century with John C. Olmsted. But I think if you compared, for instance, the father and sons and firm did a lot of Aggie schools across the country. It's really, I think, I often think that there's all these side projects that haven't yet been adequately explored, and one would maybe be just on the devotion to the Aggie school campuses across the entire history of the firm. It's quite extraordinary. But if you can compare it to OSU, for instance, with, I don't know, one of the other Aggie schools that the firm worked on in the Southeast or in the Midwest, and there are many, they wouldn't, and Senior worked on just a couple of those, but he really was, Senior was principally Stanford, and some nominal involvement with a couple of other schools early on before he lost his, before he began to approach senility. So he really only had an opportunity to work on a couple of campuses early on. And Stanford is a totally unique situation because it was really a collaboration between Olmsted Sr. and Leland Stanford, who was equally involved in the campus design, as was Olmsted, where they sort of fought it out and came to a compromise. So the nub of it is that Senior doesn't have a huge portfolio of college campus designs. It's the Olmsted brothers later, John Charles, Frederick, and other members of the firm who worked on so many campuses across America. But you can see a continuity. The continuity is undeniable. Whenever you look at any of their designs, when it comes to parks, college campuses, there's a through thread, there's a continuity, there's a commonality.
Fantastic. I think we're going to let someone whose hand is up ask a question. Yeah.
Me?
Yes, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, my name is Koichi Kobayashi. I am
Hello.
from Seattle, Washington. And then I live right on the Queen Anne Boulevard, which was realized by the Olmsted plan. You mentioned the David Streetfield. He was my co-worker when I was teaching at the University of Washington. Well, I'm a landscape architect, retired, 78 years old. And I was delighted to hear David Streetfield's used in your conclusion. We live on the same boulevard. I take this boulevard every day for a walk with my wife. I came to Seattle about a half a century ago. And then ever since that time, I had been associated with something to do with the Olmsted legacy, working as a landscape architect at the Seattle Zoo or the Arboretum or Queen Anne Boulevard. And my late friend, Bill Blair with Seattle Park, which worked very vigorously to realize some of the greenbelt envisioned by the plan. Now I have a question or comment. Looking at your presentation on your background, I said, oh, you have Irori fireplace. Can I come visit you there?
Well, your question is about my background. It's actually a virtual background, Koichi. I'm sorry to disappoint you. I do have a nice house, but I have a very messy office space. So I tend to use these virtual backgrounds that are available when you do these kinds of Zoom presentations. But I very much appreciate your contribution and the fact that you live on and utilize one of the boulevards that's part of the Olmsted plan. Also, clearly, you are a very well-trained landscape architect who knows Seattle and its plan far better than I do. Plus, you were on the faculty, as I understand it, with David Streetfield. And yes, he is one of the scholars who is of great expertise with the Olmsted landscape legacy, in particular in Seattle. So it's very nice to have you join us. Thank you for your comments.
I'd like to.
It is indeed. We appreciate your comments, and I want to say thank you to Mr. Cotton once again. It has been a wonderful presentation. I'd like to second, Laurence, what you've said about many areas that can be researched and further explored. I think tonight, by focusing on John Charles Olmsted and the Northwest, we've started to zero in on areas that I think many of us don't know much about. We tend to think of the Olmsteds in the East Coast more often than not, when in fact we know that there is an immense and rich legacy on the West Coast. And I want to thank you for pointing us to various resources by Joan Hockaday and others that already exist so that we can continue to learn more. And it certainly is a goal of the Olmsted Network to foster more exploration and more research about the great work in these areas where we don't have as much literature as we might in the future. So I want to say thank you. I want to remind everybody on this call that we have recorded this program and we will post it on our YouTube channel, where you can watch it and many other wonderful programs, including our most recent national conference, the Olmsteds in Wisconsin, where we are posting our various panel discussions. And I want you all to visit our olmsted.org website and to check our blog and calendar. And Laurence was talking about ghosts. Yes, we are near the Halloween season. So I do want to refer everyone to our special children's toolkit, where you can find a special Olmsted mask for Halloween. I guarantee you'll be the only one in the neighborhood with that. And with that, I just want to say thank you again to Laurence Cotton, who has really, as we all knew, brought us a fantastic presentation, beautiful images, and an opportunity for us to think about the great legacy in the Northwest of the Olmsted firm. So thank you, Laurence. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and watch for your newsletter and in your inbox so that you can find out programs for the future. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks
Thank you all.
again.
Bye. Thank you.